We're starting off with the C4 playlist. Should be linked in the description below. And just kind of uh, gonna get straight into it, I guess. Uh, the impetus for this morning stream originally was um, a commentary by a YouTube channel called The Critical Drinker on Batwoman and the soap opera-esque drama surrounding the uh, backstage production. And I've kind of decided, while I'm commenting on that, I will work on my archery ninjutsu sentinel. And when I was bringing the archery ninjutsu sentinel up, I realized that I either intentionally overlooked something or forgot to look at something. When I made an archery energy sentinel, I mitigated the knockback on explosive arrow. When I was making the archery ninjutsu sentinels, I did not mitigate the knockback on explosive arrow. And for the life of me, I can't remember now if that was intentional, like keeping the repel on the sentinel's fire attack, the fire willpower sentinel, or if I just completely forgot that explosive arrow had a high magnitude knockback and I needed to do something about it. Um, so I'm going to be trying to figure that out while I go through a stream of consciousness here, and I'll try to lay out the logical steps, what people casually know about the comic book industry and comic book history, and see if other people reach the same kind of conclusions I do. Now, arguably the most important starting point here is who exactly were the original comic book writers? I don't mean the exact names. I don't mean people like Bob Kane or what was it? Spiegel, the creator of Superman. I mean like what conditions were things like Action Comics being what were they being written under? And I think that's a very good question to start with because I don't think a lot of people understand where, how, when uh, the idea of comics as we, well, know them really started from. And we go back and we look at the adventure tales, the original Action Comics, the pulp comic book type, and we note that most of them were really published in around New York City. And they were sold on street corners in New York City and in magazine stands in New York City. And what's worth keeping in mind is that New York City had a very high Jewish population, not just as a result uh, of people fleeing from the Kaiser from World War One who got on ships and came to America, but also from people who flew from the National Socialist Party between the 1930s and 1940s, also fleeing Germany. Excuse me. So, kind of keeping in mind for a second, um, it you where did people actually come from? The targeted audience, the people who not just were writing those Action Comics, because keep in mind that comic books, as we know them now, were not a nationwide phenomenon. They weren't something that were being sold from New York City to San Diego. They were really localized, And maybe if they got well enough known in a particular city, they would be picked up for a local television uh, serial, like the Batman serials. The and we're looking at the same kind of era that gave us the Tarzan kind of King of the Jungle. And we look through that first era of serial production, where these things were being done and who they were being pitched to, who was actually purchasing the comic books themselves. And it's probably not unsafe to say that the comic book genre, the action hero, the pulp fiction, a lot of these original comics were really being made inside of Jewish communities and were being pitched notably at a Jewish audience. And it's important to keep in mind here that many of these original comic writers, they may not have been practicing Orthodox Jews. They may not have even been lapsed. I forget what the other kind of you have Orthodox and then you have whatever. They weren't necessarily Messianic Jews either. Uh, the vast. Okay, I'm really down on ranged after that, so I need to pick up range somehow. The mm, I guess me no not. Alright, this was fire cold AOE. Gonna be real down on AOE without that. I got any. Uh, as I rack my head over this. All right. Okay. So again, going back to these original authors, they were not necessarily Christian. They're not necessarily Jewish, but they are definitely pitching their wares, their comics, their stories at a predominantly Jewish and or Christian audience because it's who was available in the cities where the comic book form or where the pulp action format really took off. And uh, it's like DC If you just do a quick, let's look at DC Comics Wikipedia and uh, founded 1934 as National Allied Publications. And National Allied Publications was headquartered in New York City, New York. Again, massive Jewish population, massive Christian population. And we look up Marvel Comics. And I know I'm not doing this on screen, but we looked through Marvel Comics and they were active as Timely Comics in 1939. And their headquarters were Manhattan, New York City. Again, massive Jewish population, massive Christian population. And this is important to keep in mind historically in where these comics were being made, who they were being made for, who the expected audience was. And it's very fair to say that a vast majority of the writers, the creators, the Bob Kane's, uh, let me make sure I got that name right, creator of Superman, uh, written by Jerry Siegel and artist Joe Shuster. And this was cover dated 1938. And Jerry Siegel. Uh, I don't think Wikipedia is going to. Okay. It does actually give us an early life. Jerry Siegel was born on October 17, 1914, to a Jewish family. His parents were both Jewish immigrants who had fled anti Semitism in their native Lithuania. If you can't put two and two together here, his parents had fled socialist, National Socialist, the same political party that uh, pushed the Kaiser into World War One and then pushed the Führer into World War Two, the same ideology. His parents fled from that. And while Spiegel and Schuster may not have been practicing Jews or observers of the Jewish or the various Jewish faiths, because there is a split there, uh, he at least we can be pretty sure believed in the idea of a Messiah, of the messianic figure, of a deity, a deity class entity that did things because it was the right thing to do. A um, and again, this is a very strong split. And some may say it is the real difference between the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, in that the Jewish believe the Messiah is yet to come. Christians believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah and he's already been here once and he's coming back. That's pretty much the split between the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, is whether or not the Messiah has already been here, whether or not he's coming back, or whether or not his when he gets here it'll be his first time here. That's pretty much it. Aside from that one tiny difference, which admittedly is a huge major difference, there's not a whole lot of differences in the actual, well, what do you believe? Do you believe in the Ten Commandments? Do you believe that God said this? Do you believe that God said that? Do you believe that the judges had supernatural power granted unto them by God? Do you believe that Samson really could take on an army of equally fit soldiers with just the jawbone of a donkey? Do you believe that the Israelites could conquer forces that were 10 times their magnitude and size because they had the God backing them as a power? Do you believe that superhuman feats are possible because God writes the rules of reality? And if you do, then it's almost trivial to understand where the idea of Superman or the idea of Batman originate from, and that you have people who do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, because it's the moral thing to do, because it's the ethical thing to do, because it's the Jewish thing to do, because it's the Christian thing to do, because they're looking around and seeing that other people aren't doing it. Batman's story about how he's trying to fight crime in Gotham City is a real life reflection of the police departments in major metropolitan areas not cleaning up crime. In fact, the lack of attention in cleaning up crime is what would later lead in New York City to Rudy Giuliani being elected mayor, when politically speaking, it was considered impossible for someone of Giuliani party, Republican, to win in a socialist, aka Democrat, controlled city. Well, Rudy Giuliani won anyway because, well, people don't like having to fear for their life every time they go out for a walk. People don't like having their stuff stolen. People don't like walking out and finding their car radio ripped out, their windows bashed in. People don't like having their neighborhoods destroyed by graffiti. And an anti crime message, a get the villains off the street, punish the villains, and get them someplace else, is a very strong message that a lot of people understand. A lot of people relate to on an emotional level. And if a government entity isn't willing or isn't able to deal with the crime wave, well, the populations generally find someone who does. And we can see this, the clash between the ethical moral foundations and what people believed in a religious sense, and being told, well, they're not supposed to apply their religious belief to their political beliefs, and people who kind of look back on history and go like, you're joking, right? Our political beliefs are influenced by our religious beliefs, because our religious beliefs are what define our political beliefs. They're kind of inseparable. And these kind of considerations are very important to keep in mind when looking at comics moving forward. In that we've heard all these cynical stories about how various characters were created, how Iron Man was supposed to be a billionaire, something industrialist, the kind of person that the target audience for comics at the time was supposed to hate, loathe, despise. But because they gave him something wrong, that he had this something near his heart, that this reactor on his chest kept him from dying, they turned Iron Man from a character that the target audience was supposed to hate into a character that the target audience, well, could accept. Iron Man was the opposite of what the targeted audience, and we'll kind of try and put quotes on that, the target audience should have been interested in, but he was still a powerful and compelling character. And there's multiple examples of this cynicism throughout the history, if you will, of comic books in general. And it's a staggering factor to keep in mind as you keep moving forward, is that more and more you saw the religious left intervening between comic book writing, comic book target audience, and the writers and producers of comic books. And the example, and this is one my dad likes to keep using, is name one point in history when the people who burned the books, who said you cannot read this, were the good guys. Well, it doesn't take long to find examples of the socialist parties in Lithuania, in Russia, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Britain, in the United States, where the Socialist Party, the very first thing they do is, you can't read that, you can't say that, you can't think that, that's wrong think, you can't, whatever. And look back into the 1970s and 1980s as comic books really emerging from a sub-city, inner city phenomenon to national prominence as the Superman movies hit nationwide theaters, and you will believe a man can fly. And you look at that rise of comic books, and then you look at the immediate reaction that, oh, these comic books are demonic. These comic books worship evil forces. These comic books are, insert your favorite thing here. I mean, we saw the same thing with Dungeons and Dragons role playing. Is it's evil, it's wrong. And 9 times out of 10, actually more like 99 times out of 100, more like 999 times out of 1,000, the people who were screaming against these comic books, against this format, they didn't have necessarily the best interest of the population in mind, if they had any interest in mind. All they were interested in was a quick buck. Buy their book, buy their radio program, buy their tapes. And what happened? Well, the natural result was, across the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, you had active practicing Christians and Jewish faith, people who practiced those faiths, who were chased out of the comic book industry, who were chased out of the entertainment industry. And look at how Dan Quayle got dumped on for the Murphy Brown comments. Dan Quayle wasn't wrong, But look at how the reaction to that was. Look at how it was handled. And the pattern becomes very easy to see in that people are socialists drive a wedge instead of recognizing the history of comic books as something that came out of a distinct Jewish population that was targeted at a Jewish population that eventually reached a larger Christian population because that was who was in the neighborhoods where these books were being sold and published on the street corners, who was going by, the Roman Catholics who were uh, going to their jobs, who were picking up these pulp fiction books and reading them on the subways and trains in New York City. Is these core populations of who these characters had to appeal to, how these characters were based, what these characters believed, are very much defined by the religious beliefs of the original writers and the religious practices of those who were the original clients of those writers. Taking away that religious aspect is how we get to the utter failure of comic books today. And the good point in case here is Kevin Smith. Kevin Smith is reportedly supposed to be a big comics fanatic. He's supposed to be all about comics. He knows everything there is about comics. And he was given this contract to do uh, He-Man, uh, the most recent He-Man animated show, and he was once attached to a Superman movie. Apparently, he does a podcast on comics. The problem is, Kevin Smith is a film producer and actor, and he's credited with Silent Bob. Well, if you've ever watched any of the Silent Bob movies, mm, any of that, what was it? Mallrats, Clerks, if you look at Kevin Smith's filmography, you notice one thing very quickly. You don't actually have to watch the movies. You can just look up the synopsis on IMDb or Wikipedia. You can read copies of the scripts without actually having to watch it. And it becomes very clear very quickly that Kevin Smith is neither a Jewish practitioner of the Jewish faith, nor is he a Christian. In fact, his movies are actually distinctly anti Christian. He's Christian hostile. So I have to pose this question. How can somebody who is Christian hostile, I mean, whose films feature fallen angels who are supposed to be the heroes, how does that work? It doesn't. But how can someone who does that kind of content be a comics fan? And the answer is they can't, because they don't share the common relationship of the religious background with the original creators of comic books, with the original creators of the format, with the creators of the characters. And I would say this as a definitive fact: if you don't accept the idea of a Jewish Messiah, if you don't accept the idea of the Jesus Christ as the Savior, as the Messiah who has already been here, then you, as a person, aren't in a position to understand the motives, the factors that drive Superman. You're just not. And some people say, well, Superman's an alien. Well, to get to religious here for a second, when you go back and you look at the original languages of the Great Commandment to go out and spread the word that Jesus Christ is the risen Savior, the actual language used is very interesting because in English, it's often taught as go out into the entire world. But that's not what's actually said. A much more accurate translation would be go out into existence. Keep that in mind. And that even back when the command was given to go out, it wasn't limited to a planet, it wasn't limited to a continent, it wasn't limited to a city. It was go out into existence. Go out into all there is. Go out, spread the word of Jesus everywhere. Not just not just next door, not just the next town over, all of existence. How big is all of existence? Well, that's the point. The commandment is to go out into all of existence. And that's a very important distinction that is lost in translation, where the message, and this is something where Freefall has, by Mark Stanley, has come up to this, where uh, in reference to Sam the alien squid, where he's asked, has he ever heard of the God of Abraham? Is there anything in his knowledge that resembles the God of Abraham? And the answer, of course, is no. Well, that's because the message is to go out and take that message everywhere, not just here. And that's it's a very religious, very important distinction to make that's almost trivial to look over, skip, not understand, and so on. And that that's a it's a massive uh, it's a massive thing to just not think about or not deal with. And when you look at the people in the comic industry today who don't have an understanding of Latin, who don't have an understanding of Greek, who don't have an understanding of Hebrew, who believe whatever pop culture tells them, don't do basic research, don't share common values with the creators of the material that they are replicating. And that really gives us a prism in which we can look at and understand why comic book adaptations in general of original source material aren't very good, if not outright terrible. It's you can say it's as simple as, well, it's not a Christian production company, but the problem goes deeper than that, because if you look at Lord of the Rings, uh, it's fair to say that the Lord of the Rings trilogy was not done by a Christian organization. I'm not sure Peter Jackson claims to be a practicing Christian. Tolkien was a very Christian writer whose Christian themes just fill the Lord of the Rings series. It's the prism by which Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, is that his religious beliefs were a huge factor in writing the character motivations and the anti motivations of the antagonist of the story. And Peter Jackson, whatever he believes religiously, honored and respected what Tolkien wrote when filming the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And the result was a very accurate, in spirit adaptation, because Peter Jackson did not shy away from the religious implications of Tolkien's work. And then we flash forward to The Hobbit, which is a series where Peter Jackson wasn't going to do it, wasn't going to do it, wasn't going to do it, and then he did it because the studio basically threw a bunch of money at him with no pre planning. It's like the Lord of the Rings trilogy had like years, what was it, 11 years of pre production and planning, and The Hobbit had 3 months of pre production and planning, just massively different scale and scope. And that's something that's almost critical to keep in mind is who are the studios? Who are running the studios? Who make these decisions? Who actually is controlling the pocketbook? And when you look at Lord of the Rings, and it's so amazing, and it's just maybe not accurate to the books and Tom Bombadil, but accurate to the spirit of the story, because it's respecting the spirit the author intended, whereas The Hobbit is not necessarily accurate to the spirit of the book because it's being done very quickly, no pre production, it's stretching out. trying to stretch out a much smaller source material, and then we look forward to the upcoming Amazon series, and they're hiring a sexual intimacy coordinator for sex scenes. You can be very sure that whoever is actually working on the Lord of the Rings series for Amazon are not adhering to the spirit of Tolkien's writing. If anything, they're going the opposite way, and expect that to be a dumpster fire. And bringing it back around to comic books in particular, this is why I think MCU has been so successful, whereas DC in general has not. In that the MCU, for better or for worse, embraced the concepts of the characters. Even Joss Whedon, uh, to has certainly lost favor after his behavior on set has become more of a factor, and his lack of writing talent has suddenly become a huge liability. How does the joke go? Buttman and Whedon. Uh, Keeping that in mind, suddenly looking at why Age of Ultron wasn't really a good movie compared to the first Avengers team up. It's the same story recycled, the same story beats. It's Whedon's only got one playbook, and that's the only playbook he knows how to run. And then you look forward to Avengers Endgame and Infinity War. It's really good. The Russo brothers have complete control. Fast forward to Endgame, and the studio is starting to say, you must do this, you must do that. And then the story breaks recently that there were multiple versions of the female force team sent because the first version was declared to be too pandering, and the version that actually went to theaters was also face palmingly a prime example of studio interference turning a sharp vision and implementation of a character based approach into a we want to reach a market that doesn't exist, face palm, headache inducing. You did what? And it's the studios not sharing the same values, not sharing the same ideology that the original writers had. And it's a critical it's a critical difference to be considering. And kind of bringing this back around to the CW and the various shows. The CW has steadily, almost aggressively, been pushing more and more liberal oriented wedges, more uh, more themes that are targeted towards homosexuals, targeted towards the entire LGBTQ uh, spectrum. And very quickly, and the critical drinker points out, uh, you can never target that audience. A, because it doesn't exist. It's not a financial audience. You're talking about less than 1% of your total profits are incoming from targeting a politically oriented socialist audience. They're not interested in finances. They're not interested in supporting your product. They just want you to bow and support their message. Keeping that in mind, we look over at the gradual decline of the CW shows and the inclusion of these themes, and we saw it with Ruby Rose, where they hired because this cousin of Bruce Wayne, Cassandra, whatever, was supposed to be a gay lesbian woman. Uh, And then they hire someone who identifies as gender fluid, and almost immediately the um, politically oriented socialist ideology screams, well, she's not gay enough because she's gender fluid. Oh, gee, who didn't see that coming? The studio? No, the studio didn't care. It's catering to an audience that doesn't exist. That political audience was never going to support financially the show to begin with, which raises an interesting question, and it's one that Ruby Rose later raised herself. Now, a critical issue here, especially for the CW and DC, indirectly here, is that we've seen Batwoman. Okay, we didn't actually watch Batwoman on television. We watched clips of it that other people watched, and we watched versions downloaded off the Pirate Bay or sourced from other less than legal sources. Nobody. We saw the ratings. We know the ratings aren't accurate, but even the most aggressive interpretation and massaging of the ratings didn't help the fact that Batwoman wasn't being watched by anyone. There was no audience. In fact, it's very fair to say that the average YouTube clip mocking Batwoman received more views in an hour than Batwoman had over the course of his actual broadcast on a network television. That's how low the ratings were. That's how low the viewership was. Now, keeping that in mind, think about one of the claims made by Ruby Rose that if she didn't, after the surgery that she had, if she didn't get back to work, she was going to cost the studio millions. We know that Batwoman didn't have an audience. That's borne out by the ratings. That's borne out by the that is borne out by the networks themselves. There was no audience for Batwoman. There was no one watching the show. Okay? Well, if it's not a financially viable show, if no one's watching it who's in a target audience, if it the ratings are so low that they're actually within the margin of error to not even be considered for inclusion in ratings at all, they're that low. And keep in mind we're talking about a show where the audience is so low that Nick at Night reruns have quantifiably more people watching. Yeah, that's some really low figures. So where are these millions of dollars coming from? Serious question. Where are those millions of dollars coming from? Why would Ruby Rose supposedly be told that if she didn't get back to work, she was going to risk millions of dollars? I have two words for that: money laundering. And I'm not joking. I'm not joking because this is another consideration to make. Looking at the studios, we've heard the horror stories about Hollywood financing, about Hollywood bookkeeping, diff- where movies that are hit movies, Gremlins, where uh, Gremlins 2 has generated the um, creator of the franchise a larger paycheck than the first Gremlins movie. And after all the time on broadcast television, the repeated releases, the collector's editions, DVDs, the Blu ray releases, the streaming popularity, how in the world can a studio say that Gremlins, the original movie, is not profitable, but Gremlins 2 is profitable enough to cut the creator a check for only a few dollars? Well, they're lying. And this comes back to something else where I have to focus again on the religious side of things and the anti religious side of things, because there's a very important political religious statement to make here. Socialists don't care about return on investment. Socialists don't care if they lose all their money. in promoting a socialist message. Socialists only care about power, and with enough power, they can recoup any money that they've spent. And we see this with George Soros. George Soros has spent billions, trillions of dollars in the Open Society Foundation. He literally is a Nazi war criminal who is still using National Socialist money to fund his current financial empire, if he's even alive, which is a question all to itself. And no, I'm not joking there. There's an open question whether or not George Soros is dead, and his foundation is simply being run by acolytes of the National Socialist agenda, particularly his son. But I digress, even more so than usual. The important takeaway, the drastically important takeaway, is that foundationalist, conservative, Republican, whatever you want to brand it, the political right wing, the small business, the ordinary person, they look for a return on their investment. If they spend money, they want something back, something physical. They're not spending money to promote an idea. A small business owner and we'll pick on Dan Bongino for a second. Dan Bongino, when he spends money, he's looking for a return on it. It's to grow this service, to sell this product. Is he spends money to make money. Socialists, on the other hand, don't do that. They spend money for a political message and don't care if their original write off, if all the money that they originally spent is wasted. A socialist wouldn't care about funding the CW to produce Batwoman to produce a political message because as long as that political message is produced, as far as the socialist is concerned, well, job done, product achieved. And this echo forward into the United States Democrat Party, the United States Socialist Party. The Democrat Party doesn't care about how much money it spends on getting people elected as Democrats in office. All the Democrats care about is how much money those elected officials return to Democrat coffers, to the socialist coffers, after they are in power. So what's all this got to do with so what's all this heavy religious and political crossover got to do with comic books? Well, comic book characters are something that a lot of people or a lot of the current generation grew up with. They grew up watching the animated Batman television show. They grew up watching the animated Superman television show. They grew up with the Timverse. They grew up with video games with DC Universe Online. They grew up with City of Heroes. They grew up with all these comic book and influences around them. They grew up with the influx of anime and the Dragon Ball Z, the idea of superpowered beings capable of wielding forces beyond human comprehension, or inhuman comprehension, as the cases might be. And that's a very powerful audience to tap into. That's an audience that's very, if you can crack open and you can pass political messages into, you can recruit an audience. You can recruit another base. All it takes is a little bit of money and a little bit of we'll take some losses here. But it doesn't take understanding the properties. And this is the going back to the Batwoman show. Why everyone instinctually is inclined to believe Ruby Rose. It's not that she's some bastion of ethical behavior. It's not that she's some uh, moral high ground holder. It's the fact that we saw the show, we saw the acting, we saw the directing. We've made fun of the design direction. We've made fun of the production values. We've questioned, how did this even get made? We've looked at the ratings and wondered how. If a normal show had that bad of ratings after 2 or 3 episodes, they would have never even been greenlighted for a second season, much less a full season. But Batwoman was. What was trying to be achieved here? And then pass that on to the um DC Universe movies. What's trying to be achieved? Are they trying to tell a story? Or are they trying to make a political statement? More importantly, who's funding it? Because I think that's really the big question. It's not necessarily what the show says. It's not necessarily what the show does. The question is, who's funding it? Why? Again, I repeat, why would Ruby Rose be told that millions of dollars were at stake if she didn't get back to work? Now, we don't have any reason to believe Ruby Rose. We have no concrete evidence that the studio said you get back to work or you're putting millions of dollars at jeopardy. But we've seen what the studio's done. We know the behavior of George Soros. We know the behavior of the socialist agenda. We know the behavior of the anti Christian agenda. We know the behavior of the anti Jewish agenda. We know the behavior of anti Semites like George Soros. We know the behavior of the anti Semite National Socialist Party in Germany, the party of Adolf Hitler and the Führer and the Thousand Year Reich. We know what the modus operandi is. We know what the method of operation is. We know so much about how those operations work. We know so much about money laundering and power laundering. We know that there was no millions of dollars at stake in terms of financial income derived from the Batwoman TV show. But yeah, the studio said there was. Where was that money coming from? Where was that money being routed to? What happens if a political consultant is arranging for millions of dollars of illegally obtained funds, or say outside funds from a hostile government entity, say like the Communist Party of China? What happens if they're arranging for that money to be paid to the Batwoman production studio, but instead of the money actually being used on the production, instead of being paid to consultants or to production associates who worked on the production but didn't actually do anything? What if the studio was using the money being paid to the Batwoman television show to pay Democrat elect officials elected to political parties in the United States on Democrat tickets? What if there was a clear money trail from money that was being spent by people buying advertising on the show that was being paid directly to the offices of Democrat governors, Democrat congressmen, and Democrat senators? What if there was actual money trail? What if that money could be traced all the way from a CCP bank, transferred to the studio, and then transferred through a third party, and then finally winding up in the coffers of somebody who now owes the studio a political favor, or has now been paid back for money that was spent getting into office in the first place? You think I'm joking? You think I'm making this up? Yeah, sure, fine, I could be. You know I'm not, but I could be. It's all about, what do you know of the methods of operations? What do you know of the people behind it? What do you know of the shadows? What do you know of Fidelium Vigilantes? Answer those questions. Who paid for it? Why did they pay for it? What do they believe? What's their religious background? What's their anti-religious background? And suddenly, everything that's being done, and all the reason all these movies are failing, why these entertainments, these new venues are not living up to the expectations of the fan base or the people who are familiar with the characters, it becomes obvious. Somebody is paying for a political statement. They don't care if they lose money. They just care that the political statement is made. Or, if they're not paying for a political statement, they're paying for something else completely different. What are they paying for? Who are they paying? Was money from the Avengers? Was money from Infinity War, from Avengers Endgame, spent by Disney on electing political officials to office who would keep the abuse of copyright going? Can you answer that question? Was money that was spent on Batwoman on CW shows, was the only condition that that money be spent being you must have a lesbian sex scene? You must have a guy kissing a guy, and if you do that, then we'll give you X amount of money as long as you send Y amount of X amount of money to this guy who spent Y amount of money to get elected to office of governor of California. Did Gavin Newsom knowingly take money from production studios based in California that was supposedly spent on production of entertainment in order to bolster his re-election bids and to fight the recall bids? Did he? Because if Gavin Newsom did knowingly take money that was illegally funneled to his campaign and to his offices from movie studios, that's how can we say this, a felony? Guess where the money actually goes? Guess what's actually traceable? Guess what can't be hidden? You know why arrests aren't being made today? Do you know why nobody is going to jail for the massive fraud? Because law enforcement is being paid to look the other way. Let me pose a question that I posed on Twitter. What happens when people see obvious crime being performed? They see the crime being performed. They have proof that the crimes were performed, and then they see law enforcement not doing their job. When they see people who openly committed fraud, who openly committed extortion, still staying in office, still running to get reelected, and no one shows up with a pair of handcuffs and arrest warrant. What happens? What's happened in every socialist country where someone what happened in Ukraine? What happened in USSR? What's happening in Venezuela? What happens when the socialists try to steal an election? Disturbing questions, disturbing answers. I'm Aurian Archive.